parents. On Friday, July 17th, Governor Newsom announced that he was effectively barring in-school instruction for the vast majority of California students on the basis of whether they are living and studying in a county that he has put, according to his own criteria, on the state's watch list. No opportunity was given for individual school districts to proceed with the detailed and thorough plans that many of them had made for the in-school instruction that they know as educators the children in those districts need and that the parents were relying on. And also surprisingly, this decree covers private school students as well, with the effect that parents who have an interest in taking their kids out of ineffective public schools, not delivering education, are now also deprived of a private opportunity. What this leaves us with in California for the vast majority of students is that the very wealthy or kids with a parent or parents who are able to stay at home and shepherd their education are able to either homeschool or hire tutors for small groups of students. But the vast majority of children in California, middle-class children, children from minority backgrounds, children with independent education programs to help them learn because of their special needs, and children who have other struggles in the household because of a single family household, or a parent who isn't engaged, or a parent who isn't able to technologically allow them to connect effectively, or a kid who is tasked with babysitting their siblings. All of these children we saw in the spring semester of this year were failed by the state of California in its educational plans. In Los Angeles County alone, tens of thousands of students simply were unable to log in or did not show up. There was a significant drop-off in attendance. Even parents with the most motivated and academically successful children reported depression, anxiety, withdrawal, behavioral issues, a lack of motivation. Now going into the school year, a lot of parents and their children of college-bound kids are extremely anxious about their child's inability to compete because the online education the state is providing is not giving grades that allow them to compete against students from other states or even from the parts of the state that are offering in-person education. Needless to say, even non-contact sports are being disallowed. And parents of special needs children throughout the state of California, and I've spoken to dozens of them over the last few days, will tell you that the state utterly failed in even trying in most districts to provide the specialized attention that their child with autism or other learning disabilities have. And this is tragic. And it is also a betrayal of the taxpayers and of the federal mandate to educate these children. So in a very short period of time, we have drawn together the science that underscores the importance of opening these schools. And I want to emphasize that the science comes from across the political perspectives and spectrums. Just yesterday in the Boston Globe, several Harvard professors who teach public health at Harvard came together to say that it was imperative that America open up its schools. And this has been the recommendation of pediatric physicians, as well as school superintendent associations and educators throughout the United States. Indeed, California is the only state in the United States where there is a ban on the majority of children from being educated. Now, the teachers union and activists who are using fear instead of science to justify the closure of the schools will say, well, it's not safe for the kids. Well, it is safe for the kids. And in fact, the data shows that there have been 0 deaths of school-aged children in California. But what about their parents? And what about the teachers? Yes, there may be vulnerable parents and grandparents at home. There may be vulnerable teachers. We should take precautions for those. And what we are advocating is parent choice. Very simply, that parents should have the choice of whether to take the reasonable risk and make the choice to send their child to school, or condemn their child, frankly, to be being behind for a year or longer in their lives, or if they're very fortunate, to teach them at home or with a tutor. That is not a decision that the state can or should make. The governor does not have the authority, quite frankly, to do what he has done in his decree, and that is outlined in one of the claims in our case. Our plaintiffs in this case are 9 California families from across the state with different situations, different types of children in the schools with different needs and different backgrounds. What they share is despair over what California is doing to their families and their children. And these are families that could otherwise thrive and be successful in a proper supportive environment. So we came here for the kids, we came here for the families. We intend to pursue an injunction in court to prevent the governor from destroying the academic year and beyond for these families and their kids. And as a woman professional, I will add that the burden of this particular decision of the governor will set back the feminist movement by decades, because it really forces women, who are the primary caretakers still in our society of children, to choose between their children and their jobs. And we have heard this from numerous mothers who have called us. And again, this has been across the political spectrum. So with that, I will turn it over to the first named plaintiff in the case, Matthew Brack, to talk about his family's experience and why he has chosen to participate in this lawsuit. We will then hear from a second plaintiff as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Harmeet. My name is Matthew Brock. I am a board member of the Palos Verdes Unified School District. As a parent of 2 students, I've seen how the isolation and lack of in-person instruction has affected them. I am concerned for their education and also their mental health, as isolation is detrimental to a child's growth. As a school board member, I have always fought for the students of our district to get the best education that they deserve. I believe our students, like my children, are better served through in-person instruction, where they're able to interact and receive feedback from teachers and peers. Our district created a reopening task force, committees consisting of over 120 parents, teachers, staff, doctors, psychologists, nurses, and other medical professionals to design and implement plans to safely get our students back to school while adhering to the requirements of the Los Angeles County Department of Health. Through online surveys to our community, our families overwhelmingly want to return to the classrooms. And I feel that as a community, we are in a better situation with our medical professionals, educators, and the Department of Health to determine when it is safe to send our students back to school. By offering an in-person model and a distance learning model, we have created options for families and teachers, knowing that they are in the best position to determine what is right for them and their families. I understand there's a balance between public health and rights. However, any infringement upon our constitutional right to education must be tempered and done in a way that is least restrictive. Requiring communities to meet county metrics is simply not the way to do it. Thank you, Harmeet.
Thank you, Matthew. And now we're going to hear from Christine Ruiz, who together with one of her children is also a plaintiff in this lawsuit. Christine?
Good morning, everybody. Like she said, my name is Christine Ruiz. I have 2 children. One is final. For our severe child, his education abruptly ended. There has been no services provided. And mind you, when my son goes to school, he has a team, a speech therapist, occupational therapist, a master's in education and special needs teacher. Everybody is hands-on with him to teach him. He is a hands-on learner. He's not a webinar learner. He's not a Zoom meeting learner. And since that day, it has been nothing. It has been isolating. We have not been able to do anything with him. So our family has taken it upon ourselves to obtain outside services, which has been a financial hindrance to us, because regression in special education students is dangerous and profound when their services are cut off. And for us, the finances are devastating, but we are willing to chance it, because without those services, there's no life for him. He is dependent on everybody, and we're trying to counteract that and make him independent. And with the school not assisting with that in the day-to-day process, it's such a huge, it's upsetting, it's heartbreaking. And when we log on to school board meetings that we have been to see what the plan is, what's the plan for special education, where do our children stand, it's crickets. There's never any mention of our special education students, what their life will look back even if we return to school, when, if, maybe never. Online learning for our special education students is almost a death to them. And so that's why I decided to join this lawsuit and spread our story that we are the ones left behind. We are the ones not given any type of priority or thought to what our children are going to, what our future is going to look like without going back to school. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Matthew. This was put together very quickly because of the importance of this and the fact that school starts in weeks. So as you can imagine, this has been an around-the-clock effort. In this process, we have spoken to dozens of educators, activists for educators, parents, even kids, and particularly from a broad spectrum of the state. I've also spoken to pediatricians and physicians around the country who have directed us to a lot of the information that you'll see in this lawsuit that supports our position that science dictates choices for parents. Science does not support the position of the state. And I want to add that most of the teachers I've spoken to are heartbroken about this as well. People do not go into the teaching profession to not teach. Special needs educators do not go into that profession to not help their kids. And they're devastated even during the distance learning to not be able to do one-on-one education for those kids who most need it. And particularly one teacher I spoke to in Los Angeles who teaches English as a second language students was devastated to not be able to provide the services that he went into teaching for. And most teachers have choices. They could have done a lot of things in their lives. So this is not pointing fingers at the teachers. This is not even pointing fingers particularly at the governor. I think the governor has taken the path of least resistance in this case. However, the path of least resistance is blocked by the California Constitution, which requires a basic education to all students. And anybody telling the truth here would tell you that no child in California got a basic education in the spring from the state of California. So with that mandate, the state needs to try harder. The state needs to provide options. The state needs to keep vulnerable children and vulnerable teachers and vulnerable families safe and give them a distance learning option, which is doable, but provide the opportunity for in-person education, fulfill its obligations under federal law to educate children with disabilities, stop the discrimination against lower income and minority children and communities through its unilateral action, and not relegate the quality of a child's education in California to their zip code or their tax bracket, which is what the governor has done. Stepping back, Center for American Liberty has filed a number of lawsuits in California during this COVID crisis. I'm pleased to say that in response to our lawsuits, the governor of California and the state have, in some cases, worked with us, in other cases, unilaterally gone and changed their orders to open up the churches to prayer with safe, socially distanced numbers, to open up protest, which he barred originally, but after our lawsuit was filed, changed to allow protest outdoors. Open the beaches of Orange County, open several types of restaurants with social distancing measures. If you've been able to get a haircut or your nails done in California, it's been thanks to the efforts of the Center for American Liberty. And I frankly thought that we were reaching the end of having to litigate these issues in the courts because of the sensitization people have of the balance between their rights and safety and being able to make public choices. So it is with reluctance that we filed this lawsuit because really the best way for our decisions about education to be made is by the elected school board leaders, by the parents who are actively engaged in their communities, by the private school professional educators, and most importantly, by the parents and by the children themselves. But the governor took that choice away. It is devastating and it must be stopped. And we must try harder with the $100 billion budget that California has for educating its children, with the nearly $20,000 per child in the public schools that California makes available. Those dollars need to be spent to educate the children and not for some other purpose. Happy to take any questions, but I would particularly urge that reporters ask questions of our plaintiffs because they're the ones who have the most on the line here.
And really quickly, you can either send a message in the chat or raise your hand and I will make you a panelist so you can come in and ask the question. Our first question is from John Wildermuth of the San Francisco Chronicle. All right, John, you have to, I'll meet you. All right, John.
Sorry.
Oh. John, you're muted.
Am I here now?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. In the lawsuit that you sent out, many of the scientific studies were out of Europe and Australia. But when they sent their children back to school, the virus had been pretty much abated in a lot of those countries. Isn't it different in California, where the number of hospitalizations, the number of cases, and the virus is still roaring pretty good?
So I'll take that question, John. It's interesting that you say you think the virus has been abated in Europe, because if I read some of the same publications of the mainstream media that come across my email, including this morning, a sort of diatribe I saw in a major newspaper about Sweden, it looks like, according to those publications that I was reading, the virus has not abated. But what is clear, even despite that data, that certainly older and more vulnerable people may be seeing a spike in infections, although we aren't seeing a spike in the death rates, is that it still isn't affecting the children. So I don't think that those data, frankly, support the proposition that when it is safe, people are going back, because as we all know, there is no vaccine available as yet. And certainly people around the world are continuing to be urged to take precautions. The countries that you mentioned are continuing to have travel restrictions, including not only with the United States, but with any other country. And so I don't think it is fair to say that the virus has abated. Quite the contrary. In fact, what we're seeing in California is an increase in testing, which is good. We aren't seeing really a spike in terms of, when you really drill down on the data, death rates. But I think that all of the experts I've read, again, across the political spectrum, agree that the risk to children is very low, and the transmission isn't going from children to adults. It's going in the opposite direction. And so certainly, as I said, precautions need to be taken. Matthew mentioned the precautions that are being taken or were about to be taken in his school district. I don't know any educator in California who thinks we should open as business as usual. So PPE is something we've all become used to. Schools have obtained plexiglass shields. Schools have made planning for staggering the classes, for social distancing, for making sure that sports that are with contact are eliminated, and for making sure that there are options for parents or children who are particularly vulnerable and cannot send their children to school for health reasons. That needs to be an option. So I want to be very clear. Nobody here is advocating that parents are forced to send their kids to a school or that teachers are forced to put themselves at risk. There are many ways to mitigate risk. And I will add, this is at the same time that the governor is allowing solutions for businesses. For example, businesses that are doing hair salon work are allowed to do that outdoors. The state has had essential workers doing essential jobs since the beginning of this shutdown. The governor hasn't banned Costco, hasn't banned Walmart, hasn't banned your industry of reporters, hasn't banned my industry from operating. It is only the children who don't seem to have a voice who are being subjected to this. And by the way, they're the ones least at risk. So as in conclusion, I will say, we all know about statistics. We can each cite statistics for any position, and we can find a study on the contrary, find a study pro. But having spoken to a wide swath of pediatricians in the United States, they're the ones who directed me to these studies, and they believe they support for children the opening of schools. Other questions?
Yeah, hold on. We have Julia from KQED up next. Give me 1 second to. Sorry. 1 second. Julia, you're on. You just need to unmute.
Okay. Hopefully I'm with you guys.
Yep.
Okay. So we know that children do spread the virus, maybe not in the younger years, but 10 and older can be spreaders even when they're asymptomatic. We know that 75, I believe, New York City public school teachers or educators died from COVID. So I think teachers, understandably, are questioning whether they have to put their lives on the line in order to do their jobs when distance learning can work. I understand your concerns about children with special learning needs. I do hear you, but I am wondering if you're asking teachers to be willing to contract this virus and possibly bring it to their families and continue spreading it in their communities, let alone die from it, in order to meet the needs. It's a very difficult balance, isn't it?
I don't think so. So first of all, maybe you didn't hear the press conference. I'm not requiring or suggesting that anybody be forced to do anything. The teachers I've spoken to, without a single exception, and of course maybe they're self-selecting, have said that distance learning is ineffective. Not a single parent in California who I've spoken to, Democrat, Republican, educated, non-educated, rich, poor, will tell you, if they're being honest, that distance learning is as effective or even effective, quite frankly. And when you read the lawsuit, you'll see the stories of parents across the socio-political spectrum who, to a man and woman, will say that it has been ineffective. So it is absolutely a fallacy that I reject, that distance learning is effective for most students. I don't think it's effective for any students, quite frankly. Secondly, nobody is suggesting that teachers should die. I think that's melodramatic and frankly silly. That's not what this lawsuit is saying. If a teacher is concerned about dying, like I said, there are measures that we can take. They had the same concerns about dying as workers do in essential industries. People have choices. So every worker in California has a choice. These are not people being sent into the trenches to die in World War I. These are people who have access to distance, if that is what works for them as a teacher. You can certainly see a scenario where there's a classroom full of children, but the teacher, because of his or her health concerns, is zooming into that classroom, and there are teachers' aides or others there who can teach. So I think it is a false choice to say either everybody dies or we close the schools. And in fact, as the science has shown from the countries that had their schools open, it has not been the case. And certainly, if you're elderly, if you are with diabetic or disabled or have asthma, a lot of people have those concerns. We are managing to function as a society without shutting down all businesses and all walks of life. So I'm all in favor of choice. The teachers should have choices. The school districts should have choices. The parents who are very scared about some of the things that they read in the press should have choices to hold their child back from education for a year, because that's really what we're talking about here. No child is getting an effective education that is equivalent or even frankly basic under the distance learning that California is providing. And when you talk to school districts across the state, what you will find is the wealthier school districts, or the school district with wealthy engaged parents, they had better distance learning than other school districts. LA Unified School District, some school districts were basically putting on a pre-recorded program, or not even that, just sending home written assignments and making the parents do the teaching. That's not acceptable. And I know most teachers don't want that either, because students will fail. And by the way, since we're on the topic of students failing, California already has a relatively abysmal record of educating its students. When you look at the Ella T lawsuit that was filed 4 years ago in around the state, which targeted literacy and other problems in California, even prior to COVID, California's students were behind by several grades students in other countries and other states. We cannot afford to have that situation. The fact that we have COVID does not mean we should simply give up and phone it in.
The next question is from Amy Taxon, and she doesn't have audio and asked me to read it. So I'm going to go ahead and read it on her behalf from the Associated Press. I'd like to ask the following. There is a waiver process for elementary schools. Why file a lawsuit? Why not encourage schools to apply for a waiver under the guidance issued last week if their communities wish to open?
That's an excellent question, and it is addressed in our lawsuit. Our lawsuit points out that, first of all, the governor's order, we believe, is unconstitutional. It does not comport with due process. It does not comport with California law. The governor does not have the authority to unilaterally override all of the elected school boards in California and make this decision. Secondly, when you look at the very vague, frankly, shockingly vague waiver process that the governor has outlined in his vague order, you will see a number of factors that include, quote unquote, consulting with labor and a number of other categories. What does that mean? That's unconstitutionally vague. There are no standards. There are no metrics. There is no process outlined. There is no timeline. There are no criteria by which a school would know whether or not to apply for that waiver or whether or not it is possible. And by the way, if labor, which is specifically listed there as a factor in determining whether a waiver will be allowed, is allowed to veto a private school opening, well, I think you have the answer there. Frankly, I think a lot of this has been driven not by teachers, but by the teachers union itself, which has a particular political agenda that includes a lot of things that have nothing to do with educating our children, defunding the police, for example. So that's unconstitutionally vague. Now, if the governor had put forward a series of constitutional measures that would allow schools that want to apply for a waiver to fast track that, do it, know what is required, come with their packet, I think that would be a very different situation. That is not the situation that we have in California. By the way, this is a state where if you talk to people on the street, you will find that they are waiting for 4 months for EDD to answer the phone. The state has been incompetent in handling COVID. Do you think they're going to be competent in processing so-called waiver requests according to unpublished, vague, and frankly unknowable criteria? It appears that the governor put this whole program together very hastily. Unfortunately, that doesn't comply with due process. So that's the answer to that.
Okay. We have no more pending questions. Does anybody else have any questions before we conclude?
I would love to give a chance to our two parents here to give a final remark. I've spoken a lot here, but this is really about them.
We did get another question, so we can do that towards the end. I'm going to make Maureen Taylor. She should be joining us momentarily. Okay. Maureen, you're on. You're going to have to unmute yourself.
Hi there. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
If you're able to hear me, Harmeet, I have a quick question for you. Can you elaborate more on the teacher choice of how do you see this happening with open schools if the teachers have choices whether to participate or not? Can you elaborate on how you would see that working?
Absolutely. So I'm not an educator, but we have one here, a parent, Matthew Brack, who's on a school board, and he can tell you that the school made plans for both. Now, what we're going to have here is, and I've spoken to a lot of parents, by the way, again, across the political spectrum. I know some conservative friends of mine who are very scared about what they read, and they don't, or they have diabetes and they don't want their child exposed to anything, and they're willing to hold their child back from education for a year. There will be some parents who don't want to send their kids to school for whatever reason. And there will be some teachers, because of their own health vulnerabilities or because of their fear, not science, that they do not want to go and teach in the schools. Those would be a perfect match for one another. And some of our school districts are pretty big. As you know, Los Angeles, all the big cities have large school districts. We should match those groups of parents and teachers together. That's one option. I sketched out another option in my comments, which is you could have teachers Zoom into a classroom where kids are otherwise able to enjoy the benefits of in-person learning in their other classes, but maybe that teacher provides instruction by distance learning. What I find interesting is when I spoke to a school superintendent in a major district yesterday, or actually Sunday over the weekend, I was told that that particular district intends to have teachers come in to the classrooms to teach remotely, which seemed interesting to me because at least that was giving the projection to the kids at home, if they're doing it from home, that this is a formal process and the teachers aren't doing it with their children and their dogs and their distractions in the background. Apparently teachers didn't want to do that because teachers have their own needs to take care of their own kids. So I want to be clear, what the governor has done here is imposed a lot of burdens on teachers as well. And I think quite a few teachers are now torn between their ability to even do their jobs in distance learning and take care of their own children. That's the problem for every parent in California. So in conclusion, in a state with 40 million people, a minority of whose children are going to want to have distance learning, and probably a minority of teachers who feel the same way, I think there are technological solutions that we can bring to bear that would marry those two together and make sure that there are choices for everybody. I know this is hard, but the fact that it is hard does not give California, which has a constitutional duty to educate the children in a basic way, a pass. As I've said publicly before, this is a country that put a man on the moon. This is a state that's spending tens of billions of dollars on a bullet train. We have solved a lot of engineering problems in this state. We have the world's top technology in Silicon Valley and engineers who would love to devote their resources to figuring out how to solve this problem. And we have a few weeks left to do that. So I think we should try problem solving rather than simply giving up.
Mr. Brock, I think you want to add something if you want to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Option is what we've been focused on since this all began. We've surveyed our parents, we've surveyed our teachers. We understand that everybody is in a different situation. So we are providing those options. We have excellent teachers up here. We have some of the best teachers in the state who want to come back to school, who received an email last night from a first grade teacher who said there's just simply some skills that cannot be taught online. And she's anxious to get back into the classroom. We have other teachers who in the last semester did really well in distance teaching as well as you could do. So they are, we're hoping that they will take the reins and, move towards the distance education for our students who want to stay home. So again, as Harmeet said, this is not about compelling anybody to do anything in our districts. This is about pairing people with their choices so that we can get our students back in class. And thank you.
Before we move to closing comments, is there any final questions from any of the journalists? Oh, we just got one from Julia from KQED again. She writes, before the governor announced Friday, teachers were concerned about safety measures, our inability to test and contact trace. They want to come back, but only under safe conditions that takes more money to supply these measures. Berkeley has spent $10 million and has been reimbursed $700,000. Budgets are in crunch mode. So how could schools afford to reopen given the lack of basic testing in place, as one example?
Those are good questions. So I think the answer is the state is failing. Those are more examples of the state failing. That's not an excuse for the state to give up. The state has a constitutional duty to educate the children. I just gave you an example of a boondoggle where the state is spending tens of billions of dollars on a train that is frankly nonsense and nobody supports anymore. Why don't we shift some of the money in the budget that's not being used into educating our children? Because that's, by the way, a statutory duty and a constitutional duty. Some of the other stuff we waste money on in the state is not. The fact that the state is failing to reimburse municipalities for their safety measures is appalling. I think it is appalling that people who are unemployed in the state are not able to get through to EDD. How hard is it to man the phones? There are a lot of, phones are something that you should be able to handle. So I don't think that's an excuse for the state to just give up because there's too much at stake here. When you read what the pediatricians are saying about the mental and physical scars that will be permanent on many of these kids, you realize what is at stake. Those of us who are adults, can't go to work, you have to do your job from your living room, will bounce back. Some of these kids will not bounce back. And that is going to pay negative dividends for our state and our country forever. And so there's too much at stake. Personally, as a person who's critical sometimes of the bloated budgets of our state, this is something we need to be spending money on to the exclusion of everything else. And so I would support that, and people need to be pressing the governor to answer those questions.
Okay, I don't think we have any more questions if you want to move into your final comments.
My final comments are, like I said, I regret that we are making policy by litigation here, but that's frankly what's happened throughout the COVID crisis. I think the governor is a person who, certainly is trying to satisfy a number of different constituencies. He's chosen the wrong constituency to satisfy here by listening to the squeakiest wheels and not the parents who are voiceless, the parents who are working two jobs, the parents who, despite his moratorium eviction, are afraid of their family being kicked out onto the street, the parents who are asking their children to babysit their other children so that they can avoid starvation. These are the choices that the governor is imposing on these children. We all know from pediatricians and from experts that distance learning is condemning many children to abuse at home, to sexual abuse, to neglect, to food insecurity, to a host of issues that our schools have come to address over time. So it isn't just about the ABCs. It isn't just about the fact that they can't do their science lab, their chemistry lab to get into their pre-med program by distance learning. It's really about life and death for some of these kids. A 1% increase in the suicide rate among children, which is what the trends are in some of the districts that have looked at these issues, will be far more of a mortality rate than COVID. And so I view this as a crisis. And I hope that when the governor takes a second look at this and hears the voices of parents, he comes to the table and we work out a solution that, again, gives parents and schools and school districts choices. That is all we are seeking in this lawsuit, is choice. And choice is the watchword of our society. The education is an obligation of the state. It must be done in a way that is effective. And finally, I want to make sure we don't forget those special education children. You may think that's a minority of kids, but it's an increasingly large percentage of kids who get support through the system. And they got zero support, most of them. And I spoke to an African-American educator yesterday who told me that her own nephew, basically the special education teacher, after a half-hour session, just threw up her hands and said, I can't do this, and hung up. And that was it for the whole semester. That was in March. This is unacceptable. And that's not just an anecdote. I have not spoken yet to a single person who tells me the distance learning went great for everybody concerned, because that's not true. So in conclusion, thank you for your attention to this very important issue. I think there is no more important lawsuit that the Center for American Liberty has filed than this lawsuit that affects more people in the state of California. It really affects the majority of the population of California. It affects employers. It affects parents. It affects teachers. It affects $100 billion of spending. Plus, it affects the future of our economy and our society. So it's really important. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.